This is Tom Doody, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. Vanity Fair, September 2013. Goldman's Geek Tragedy by Michael Lewis. A month after ace programmer Serge Aleynikov left Goldman Sachs, he was arrested. Exactly what he had done, neither the FBI which interrogated him nor the jury which convicted him a year later seemed to understand. But Goldman had accused him of stealing computer code, and the 41-year-old father of three was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Investigating Aleynikov's case, Michael Lewis holds a second trial. To Serge Aleynikov, new way of thinking, every American could benefit from some time in jail. But in that event that you are yourself actually arrested and sent away, there are certain physical aspects to keep in mind. First, dress warmly. Detention centers tend to be freezing cold, even in summer. And if you happen to be wearing shorts or short sleeves, you're in for a spectacularly unpleasant night. Second, no cash. If you have money, they charge you a convenience fee, he explains. If you don't have it, they don't charge you. The less money you have, the better. Third, memorize a couple of emergency contact numbers. On the night of his first arrest, he discovered he didn't actually know his wife's cell phone number. He'd always phoned her by the name on his cell phone address book, but his phone was one of the first things they'd taken from him. The fourth and final rule was by far the most important. Don't say a word to government officials. The reason you don't, he says, is that if you do, they can place an agent on a witness stand and he can say anything. On the night of July 3rd, 2009, as he came off the Chicago to Newark, New Jersey, he was totally unprepared because he had never imagined himself as the sort of person who might commit a crime. He worked too much and took only the vaguest interest in his fellow human beings. But up to that moment of his arrest, Aleynikov had no sense that there was anything wrong with him or his situation. On the surface, his life was never better. Third child had been born, had a new job, and a hedge fund had paid him $1 million a year. And he just moved into a big new house of his own, designed, and he thought of at the perfect home. He'd come to America 20 years ago with little English and less money, and now he was living the dream. For much of the flight from Chicago, he'd slept. Leaving the plane, he'd noticed 3 men in dark suits waiting in the alcove of the jetway reserved for baby strollers and wheelchairs. They confirmed his identity, explained they were the FBI, handcuffed him, and walled off from the other passengers. The last act was no real feat. Serge was only 6 feet tall, but weighed roughly 130 pounds. To hide him, you need only to turn him sideways. He resisted none of the actions, but he was generally bewildered. The men in black refused to tell him his crime. He tried to figure it out. His first guess was that he had gotten mixed up with some other Serge Aleynikov. Then it occurred to him that his new employer, the legendary high-frequency trader Misha Malyechev, might have done something shady, wrong on both accounts. It wasn't until the plane had emptied and they'd escorted him to a New York airport that they told him of his crime, stealing computer code owned by Goldman Sachs. The agent in charge of the case, Michael McSwain, was fairly new to law enforcement. Oddly enough, he'd been a currency trader on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange for 12 years. He'd ended his career on Wall Street the same year, 2007, that Serge was beginning his. McSwain marched Serge into the black town car and drove him to the FBI building in Lower Manhattan. After making a show of stashing his gun outside, Serge said McSwain led him to a tiny interrogation room, handcuffed him to a rod on the wall, and finally read him his Miranda rights. Then he explained what he knew, or thought he knew, and in April 2009, Serge had accepted a job at a new high-frequency trading shop called Teza Technologies, but had remained at Goldman for the next 6 weeks until June 5, during which time he sent himself through so-called subversion repository, 32 megabytes of source code from Goldman high-frequency stock trading system. The website Serge had used, which has the word subversion in its name, as well as the location of the server, Germany, McSwain clearly found highly suspicious. He also seemed to think it significant that Serge had used a site not blocked by Goldman Sachs, even after Serge tried to explain to him that Goldman did not block any sites used by its programmers, but merely blocked its employees from porn and social media sites and such like. Finally, the FBI agent wanted him to admit that he had erased all the bash history, that is, commands he had tried to type into his own Goldman computer keyboard. Serge tried to explain why he had done this, but McSwain had no interest in his story. The way he did it seemed nefarious. The FBI agent would testify later. All of which was true as far as it went, but to Serge, that didn't seem very far. I thought it was like crazy, really, he said. He was stringing these computer terms together in ways that made no sense. He didn't seem to know anything about high-frequency trading or source code. For instance, Serge had no idea where the subversion repository was physically located. It was just a place on the internet used by developers to store code they had worked on. The whole point of the internet was to abstract physical locations of servers from logical address. To Serge, McSwain sounded like a man repeating phrases he had heard from others, but to him actually meant nothing. There is a game in Russia called phone book, like the American telephone, he says. It felt like he was playing that. What Serge did not know was that Goldman had discovered his downloads just a few days earlier, months after he made the first of them. They called the FBI in haste just 2 days before, and then put their agents through what amounted to a crash course on high-frequency trading and computer programming. McSwain later conceded that he didn't seek out independent expert advice to study the code Serge Aleynikov had taken. I relied on the statements of Goldman employees. He himself had no idea of the value of the stolen code. Representative Goldman told that it was worth a lot of money, or if any of it was actually all that special. He based his belief on the code contained trading secrets, representations made by members of Goldman Sachs. The agent noted that Goldman files were on both personal computers and a thumb drive taken from Serge at Newark Airport, but virtually none of those files had been opened. If they were so important, why hadn't Serge looked into them in the months since he left Goldman? The FBI's investigation before the arrest consisted of trusting Goldman's explanation of extremely complicated stuff, and 48 hours after Goldman called the FBI, Serge was arrested. This has been Tom Doody. End of part 1. This has been Tom Doody, Google, middle-aged American living in New Jersey near the Lincoln Tunnel. If you were to visit my website, you would type Howdy Doody into Google. You'll find the correct spelling of the famous puppet. You then combine Tom Doody in a Google search for my site. Thank you for listening. Have a good day, good evening, a restful night's sleep. Ciao.